For the first time, the average pay for restaurant and grocery workers is above $15 an hour. According to Labor Department data, nearly 80% of U.S. workers now earn at least $15 an hour. That's up from 60% in 2014. According to several job sites and recruiting firms, many job seekers won't even consider jobs that pay less than $15 an hour anymore. Kim, how is it that the private sector, the economy, has moved so much ahead of where the public has set the minimum wage?
Well, I mean, it comes down to supply and demand, right? And right now, by the way, is a really, really, really good time for workers to start demanding higher wages. When you just drive around, every business has a help wanted sign, right? So it's time for workers to say, almost act as like a collective union and to say, okay, we're not going to work for less than some sort of living wage. I mean, $15 an hour, by the way, in most of the big cities is still not enough. But certainly, there is something to that supply and demand, but that's still not enough. I mean, obviously, minimum wage should be at minimum tied to inflation. Alyssa, what do you think?
Well, the timing is very interesting. So we do have a labor shortage right now, due in part to the pandemic, but then also the fact that we have had unemployment insurance extended for significant periods of time, as well as direct payments to millions of Americans. So you have 10 million people unemployed, but then you also have businesses that can't hire because, frankly, a lot of folks are making more staying home. I like Kim's point, though, and I wonder if this is a driver behind it, is that this does actually give some leverage to the worker to then go in and say, listen, you need to fill these roles, but I can't work for less than this. I'm always of the mind, as a conservative, that I'd rather this be driven by the private sector and have, the workers advocate for themselves than be forced from the government. But I think it's a mixture of factors, and it's a good thing. People need a living wage. Don't think it needs to be set by the government. A one-size-fits-all doesn't make sense in a very, very diverse country. And it appears more companies are getting on board with the minimum wage increase, by the way. This week, CVS announced they'll join big employers like Target and Best Buy and start paying workers $15 an hour by summer of 2022. Ryan, what do you make of this?
It's interesting that you have Republicans and a good number of Senate Democrats who are still resistant to the minimum wage, when not only are the vast majority of workers making at least that, but you have these major companies. Amazon is kicking around raising wages even higher than $15 an hour. You got Best Buy and Target, CVS putting it at a minimum of $15. You've got a situation where people simply don't want to show up for any less than that, and good for them. A lot of it has to do with the restaurant lobby, because it may seem strange from the outside. Why is everybody fighting over 15? Turns out in the Senate, it actually isn't really necessarily about the 15. Manchin is still hung up on the 15 because wages are still so low in West Virginia. But the rest of the Senate Democrats who are opposed to it are opposed because the restaurant lobby has argued that if you raise the tipped minimum wage, you're going to put a bunch of restaurants out of business. Kim, how do you see this playing out, the conflict between all workers across the country who want a higher minimum wage, and then the restaurant lobby that says, well, let's not do anything until we've made sure that we've carved ourselves out of it?
Yeah, obviously, anytime a business is involved and a lobby is involved, then it's going to go the way of the big business and the lobby. But, I think that there might be another way to look at this. And I understand the businesses, their perspective on it, saying, well, we just can't raise these wages. And some, San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles are going to be different than places like in the middle of Kansas or in the middle of Idaho. But, I always wonder, maybe there's a better way. I know that we've, for the longest time, always done a minimum wage, but maybe it should be tied directly to housing and rent prices in each area. I just want to kind of throw out there a different solution, which is if you were to say, look, zip code by zip code, you have to pay your workers based on, a rate that is tied directly to the housing. Because honestly, you could pay somebody $3 an hour. I don't think the actual number matters. You could pay somebody $3 an hour, but if the rent is only $150 a month or $100 a month, then that works out. But we keep having to raise up the price of the minimum wage because we're having such inflation when it comes to housing costs. So I think if we did that, if we said, look, let's just throw away the entire concept of minimum wage the way that it is, a national, a federal minimum wage, and instead tie it to something that is the largest expense in a person's budget, then maybe we would actually make a little bit more progress on it. And also what it would do is it would, you would have these restaurant owners, you would have these businesses suddenly advocate in their communities for lower housing prices because they want to lower their wages. So there might be some benefit, some win-win there. But, creative solutions might be the path forward.
And I think it makes significantly more sense the way that Kim explained it, because of course $15 goes much further certain places, not quite as far others. But I would say this, before we give too much praise to these massive corporations deciding to pay $15 an hour, they can afford to. Frankly, they can probably afford to pay $20 an hour. What I would raise, though, for this discussion is thinking of the small businesses that are coming out of a pandemic. They're coming out of a time when they were artificially shut down and stopped from being able to work, being able to generate revenue for months at a time, if not 6 months. Now saying, oh, by the way, you have to pay your workers this amount. They don't have the capital to do it. These are not massive, Fortune 10 companies, run by Jeff Bezos. These are mom and pop shops. So I would guess to say the average worker who's out of work and looking to get back into the workplace would prefer something rather than nothing. But it's a start for these major corporations. It's what they need to do.
Yeah, and Kim's point is an interesting one because it goes to the math problem that so many people have, that the cost of housing, the rent or their mortgage is so high that that by the middle of the month they've run out of money. You just can't make the math work with these low wages and the high cost of housing. The historical context is interesting though, because when you link too many things together, you wind up accidentally driving inflation, which then causes kind of the power structure to then attack wage earners. And so in the 1970s, for instance, when you still had high union density, the union contracts were tied to inflation. Wage increases were tied to inflation. And so every year when the inflation numbers would come out, then the wages would go up relative to that inflation, which they should have. That's something that it was smart for the workers to fight for. But then what the Federal Reserve did and what Carter and then Reagan did is say, wait, this cycle is killing everybody, because as inflation is going up, wages are going up. As wages are going up, then companies are raising prices to cover those new wages. The prices going up are then reflected in the inflation numbers, which then come back to the higher wages and then come back to higher prices. And that's how you got that inflation in the 70s. And so they solved it by just crushing the working class, by just destroying working people and basically eliminating private sector unions across the country. So you have to be careful not to set up a situation like that where you make progress and then everybody gets flattened again. I'm being told we're going to have to leave it there, but we will have more Rising for you right after this.